I grew up in a ranch-style home in Southern California in San Diego. Our house had this big glass atrium in the center, and one wall of glass opened into the kitchen. So every day when we sat down to eat at the kitchen table, I was looking at this sort of beautiful greenhouse of flowers that my mom had set up in the center of the home. And there was also a big window facing our backyard over the sink. So when we were washing dishes, we could watch, the garden, the herb garden, and all the birds and all the bees and stuff outside. But there wasn't much fancy about anything. And sometimes now when I think about it, I'm like, how did my mom cook such beautiful food out of that dinky kitchen? There was an electric stove most of my childhood, which as now a professional cook, I really disdain, and two electric top and bottom ovens that didn't work so well, and not that much counter space. And once I started cooking, going home and trying to use my mom's tools, I was like, how did she cook with these really dull knives all these years? So to me, I'm really impressed with the love and the quality of food and the amount of food that my mom was consistently able to produce out of such a small kitchen. And I think about that a lot still today, because the apartment where I live has a pretty dinky kitchen. And, I really believe it's not the tools or the stuff you have that determines what kind of food or how good your food can be. So my parents came to California a few years before I was born, and I think they weren't sure if we'd ever return. So for my mom, cooking and sharing our culture through our food was really her most important and most powerful tool of giving us a sense of our heritage, me and my brothers. And so I always say that we spent 40% of our childhood in the back of the Volvo station wagon driving around Southern California, because my mom was so committed to finding the flavors and the tastes of Iran and immersing us in those flavors and teaching us what our heritage tasted like. So she would drive across Southern California in search of the perfect flatbread or in search of just the right kind of Danish feta cheese. And I didn't know anything else. So I thought that was a normal way to shop, a normal way to seek flavor. And the highest compliment any ingredient or any dish could ever receive from anyone in my family was that it tasted like Iran. Persian food is really time-consuming to prepare and labor-intensive. And there's so much chopping of herbs and standing and stirring. And so it was really hours every day that my mom spent preparing food for us. And while I didn't understand, what that commitment really took until much later, I certainly could taste it because her food was extraordinary. And I was able to taste the love and the care that she put into it. Going to Berkeley was not really what I wanted, and it was also not really what my family wanted. But ultimately, it became a blessing. My first year, I was really out of place, and my second year, I took an incredible, beautiful, moving, memorable class with Robert Haas, who was then the Poet Laureate of the United States. I just felt like I was learning what I was meant to learn, and I was immersed in the beauty of poetry, and it spoke to me. And then one day in class, this beautiful young man stood up and gave the most impassioned answer or response to a question. And I just looked at him and I developed the biggest crush on him. And later we became best friends, and eventually he became my boyfriend. And really, with him, I found a place, and we spent so much of our time together eating and looking for delicious things. For the first time between that class and him, I started to feel like I belonged. He had always wanted to go to Chez Panisse, which is a world-class restaurant in Berkeley that I had never heard of because I didn't grow up eating in fancy restaurants. So we saved our money for 7 months. We saved $220 up so that we could go eat at Chez Panisse. He drove a metallic turquoise convertible Volkswagen Bug, which was my dream car since I was in high school. Another sign we were meant to meet. I was wearing a black tank top and a denim skirt. I was 19 years old. We were totally out of place in the formal dining room. I think the staff, was charmed by us. I'd never been in a restaurant where it felt like I was at someone's home and I was being so cared for. The dessert was a chocolate souffle. And when the server brought it, she asked if I had ever had souffle before. And I said, no. And she said, would you like me to show you how to eat it? And I said, yes. So she said, you have to poke a hole in it with your spoon and pour this sauce in so that every bite has raspberry sauce. So I did that, and I took a bite, and she asked how it was. And I said, oh, it's really good. But you know what would make it even better is a glass of cold milk, because, like warm chocolate thing, cold milk. Classic combo. But what I didn't know at the time was that, first of all, it's super rude to tell somebody what would make their dish better. And secondly, that in fine dining, it's considered like only babies drink milk after 11 a.m. So asking for milk sort of like tipped my hand, as if they didn't already know that I knew nothing. So she sort of laughed, and she brought me a glass of milk, and then she brought us each a glass of dessert wine to teach us the refined accompaniment. I was so inspired, and I always had jobs throughout college. So I wrote a letter begging for a job, just saying how moving this meal had been. And I brought it in, and they said, oh, you need to give that to the floor manager. So they brought me to the floor manager's office, and I knocked on the door, and she opened the door, and it was the souffle lady. And, in retrospect, she was probably really like, desperate, because she said, you want to start tomorrow? So I was hired on the spot, and I started the next day, which was, I think, the 28th birthday of Chez Panisse. And it was really the first day of, the beginning of my career and my professional life. Really, I think of Chez Panisse as a temple to the senses. You walk in, and there is the most beautiful flower display you've ever seen. The light is always set just so to really bring up the warm tones of the copper and the wallpaper. There are displays of the most perfect fruits and vegetables that are in season today, right there from the minute you walk in all the way into the kitchen. The sounds are just, there's not music playing. It's the sound of cooking, and the sound of eating fills the restaurant. I'm really sensitive to those sounds now. Part of it is that the chef who really taught me, Chris Lee, was a musician. And so he taught me a lot about listening to even just the appliances in a kitchen. He said, oh, all appliances in a kitchen are humming at a B flat. And I was like, what? There's an amazing pastry chef, Mary Canales, who now has her own ice cream shop. But at the time she was in the restaurant. And she said, oh, I can hear when the ice cream is done spinning in the machine, because the tone of the hum changes, because it's no longer liquid and now it's solid. Stuff like that. Like a pork chop should never crackle, and it should also never be silent. So that little sizzle is what I always listen for anytime I throw anything down onto the grill or into a pan. So I started cooking in this incredible, elite, world-class kitchen with cooks who were among the best in the world. And every day I'd show up to work, and they could cook anything. At home, I would go home and cook out of a cookbook. But at work, these guys never used cookbooks. They never used recipes. They just used their senses, and they tasted, and they paid attention to what was happening. And they never used measuring cups or timers. And it was so confounding to me. So it took me about 1.5 years of showing up every day and being confused and paying attention to start seeing these themes and understanding that really 4 elements just kept reappearing in our cooking every day, no matter what we were making, whether it was French or, North African or Italian or Greek or Southern American. So it was probably 1.5 years into my cooking that I had a moment where I realized, oh, salt, fat, acid, heat, these 4 things, we pay attention to them every day. And I went up to the chef and I said, I figured it out. Salt, fat, acid, heat. And he just looked at me and he was like, yeah, duh, we all know that. Right then in that moment, I realized that since this information wasn't reflected in any of the books that I was reading, that I could write this book. I was about 20 or 21 years old, and I was like, I'm going to write this book. It's going to be short. It's going to be simple. It's going to be so easy to write. And then it took me about 17 years to write it. I was afraid to start writing. It was my mentor, Michael Pollan, who really encouraged me to turn this first into a class, to create a curriculum, to create a vocabulary around it, to understand what landed with my students, and then to sit down and draw a book out of that material. So when I get to cook for people who I care about, it's really one of the greatest pleasures of my life. And it starts for me with the shopping, which I know can be a drag most of the time, but I take such great pleasure in finding the most special things on that day. And so if it's available to me, I'll go to a farmer's market or a special produce market, but sometimes that's not around. And so it just means going to the grocery store in whatever town I happen to be in and wandering the aisles until I see, maybe really fresh broccoli or a new kind of rice that I've never used. And then I come home and I lay everything out. Maybe by then I have an idea of what I want to make, or maybe I don't. And I sort of start putting things together and I taste the whole way. And often between the shopping and the snacks I eat when I'm shopping and the tasting that I do all throughout the cooking, I'm often pretty full by the time it's time to sit down and eat. So it's just about, for me, that act of like showing how much I care and being a host. That's really what fulfills me and makes me so happy. I love inviting people over and pouring them a glass of wine. I love bringing them into the kitchen to help me finish. I take so much pleasure in those little moments that happen between people that are unexpected, that happen when their guard is down. And so my goal is always to make people as comfortable and to feel as cared for and loved as possible so that those conversations can happen. It's not even about the fanciest food or even the most delicious food. It's about setting a tone of being cared for that I think lets you feel like anything can happen.